Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'an. So today we're going to be talking about crime and punishment, which is basically offenses in Islam, the chapter of hudud and jinayat. Crime and punishment. So first of all, Islam has prescribed certain punishments for certain crimes, and it's left open the punishment of other crimes. So who has an obligation to enforce these punishments? It's the Muslim ruler, meaning there's a legitimate authority who is in charge of the Muslim community, and that person is responsible to enforce certain discretionary punishments in the first place. So if you think about it, every single government in existence, no matter how primitive or how advanced they are, they have some form of punishments in their system. And that's to prevent people from doing bad things and to have a more structured, safe, organized, and prosperous society. So every single civilization has certain discretionary punishments. And those are usually left up to the ruler to enforce themselves. So in Islam, we have the same thing. So any Muslim leader or Khalifa or ruler, anytime somebody does something wrong, they have the authority and they have the green light to enforce certain punishments to make sure that people are in line. So for example, somebody defaces property, somebody's private property or public property, by spray painting graffiti on the walls. What do you do to that person? Do they deserve some punishment, or should they just, you just ask them to say sorry and ask Allah for forgiveness and you let them go? For the safety of the community, or for the for the safety of society, and to make sure that this is not happening on a regular basis, you have what's called a discretionary punishment. Somebody disobeys the traffic laws, you have a punishment, right? To make sure that those laws, they're for the safety of the people. So these are what are known as discretionary punishments, and they're up to the leader or the Khalifa to enforce. But no individual can enforce this. Right? So if you see somebody speeding down the highway, even if you're under a Muslim system, you cannot go and stop that person and you see them on the side of the road, say, hey, I saw you speeding. So I'm going to collect $100 from you and I'm going to give it to the police station, the local police station. You don't have the authority to do that, right? Because you have no official authority to implement some kind of law in that society. So likewise, any type of punishment that's going to be implemented has to be through a recognized authority in that community, right? I'll give you an example. Example was when I was studying in one of the schools, I won't tell you where, I had an MP3 player with me, and this was like a really top of the line MP3 player at the time. I loaded up all my lectures onto it. I went there, and I didn't have access to a computer, I didn't have anything, and I was listening to these lectures to benefit myself, and somebody stole my MP3 player. And I found out who it was, and we found out who it was, and we knew exactly who it was who stole it, but the school wouldn't do anything about it. The school didn't even want to talk to the person. So really I felt like, you know what, we just got to take justice into our own hands, right? So we got a team of people together. We were about to enforce justice. We were about to do it, really, until one of my teachers convinced me that we shouldn't do it. And I said, this is wrong because the school did not help, the teachers did not help. I was very, very upset. Somebody needs to be responsible for this, and there's no justice being served. So how do you serve justice in this case? So I said, the only way is to take things in our own hand and get justice served. Otherwise, this guy, he's stealing stuff from other people. He stole something from my other friend, one of his expensive colognes, some French cologne or whatever it is, and he started stealing stuff from other people. So what do you do in this case? So then my teacher sat me down. He said, look, I want you to understand something. The only reason why an authority should be implementing the punishment and not the average person taking it into their own hands is because what do you do when someone goes and takes it into their own hands, but they're not serving justice? They're actually oppressing the other person. What do you do in that case? What's that going to lead to in society? It's going to lead to a sense of anarchy. So he says, this is why it's not allowed in Islamic law to do what you're planning on doing, even if you may be right. even if you know this person has done it and the administration has not done anything for it, for the security of society as a whole, it has to be someone who is an official authority implementing punishments. Otherwise, everyone will go and do whatever they want and then claim that it's just, but you can't tell whether it's just or it's not just. So the whole, Batman, Robin Hood type of thing, it's technically not allowed in Islam. Now, are you going to be held accountable for it in the sight of Allah? That's a question that's dependent upon circumstances. But Islamically, it's not allowed. So it has to be under an authority to prevent anarchy within society. Okay? So anyone who disobeys traffic laws, anyone who does graffiti, anyone who does whatever it is, the ruler can have a discretionary punishment, and that could be whatever. So it can be, for example, whipping. It can be community service. It can be imprisonment. It can be a fine. It's open. Okay? There are restrictions, right? But it's generally open to the ruler. Now we talk about another group of punishments which are called the hudud. Okay, the hudud laws. And this is a specific set of punishments which is prescribed for certain offenses in order to keep them in check, in order to keep them away from society. So a discretionary punishment, for example, usually is not allowed to be more than 10 lashes of a whip or anything worse than that. That's pretty much a limit that has been set. So you never go and torture a person, or you don't go and you can't kill a person for some kind of random crime. Speaking against the government, for example, you say, well, this is a problem, or whatever it may be. Things along those lines, or making fun of somebody, or kicking somebody, or whatever other punishment it may be. Let's say blowing up a building, but you didn't kill anyone. Right? You cannot exceed a certain punishment in Islam because that's not one of the prescribed punishments that have been set by the Sharia, by Islamic law. But what we do have is something called the hudud. The hudud literally means limits or barriers. So hudud refers to the hudud of Allah, the limits that Allah has set, which you should not be crossing. And also these things serve as barriers to protect people from falling into these type of things and having society filled with these type of crimes. So a discretionary punishment, for example, should not exceed 10 lashes of a whip. You could do 5, you could do imprisonment, you could do a fine, you could do whatever it is. But when it comes to the hudud laws, there's a specific punishment that has been set, and you should neither exceed it, nor should you reduce it. So this is something which has been set particularly in Islamic law. So every single one of the crimes that the hudud law covers is a major sin in Islam. Okay, every single one of them is a major sin in Islam. So why this specific punishment? It's because it's for a number of things. Number one, it's going to help people stay away from committing these sins in the first place. Right? Number two, it's going to help the society as a whole to not have these vices within the community. So the 5 punishments are, number 1, adultery and fornication. That counts as 1. Number 2, false accusation of adultery or fornication. Number 3, theft. Number 4, drinking. And number 5, banditry. Okay, and I'm going to explain all of these in detail. Now, if we want to understand them, let's try to understand why these punishments in particular, and why they're different than, why is there so much discussion or controversy over these things, particularly in Western society? It's because in Islam, the Islamic law or the Sharia, it aims to protect 5 things. And this is how the scholars have understood it. It's called the maqasid of the Sharia. The aims or objectives of what all these laws and rules are designed to do in the first place. So they're designed to protect 5 things and keep them intact. Number 1 is religion, protection of religion. Number 2, protection of property or wealth. Number 3, protection of the intellect. Number 4, protection of life. And number 5, protection of family and honor. So there are 5 things in Islam. Now what that means is protection of religion, meaning there are certain rules that are put in place in order to protect religion itself. Meaning people being able to practice Islam and other people being able to practice their own religions. There are certain laws which are in place. Protection of property, for example. So there are punishments that are involved when you steal something, because if you didn't have any punishments or you didn't have any laws or rules regarding that, what would happen? Then people can steal whatever they want. They could take somebody else's property, and people's property and wealth now is in danger in society. So you don't know what's going to happen to your property. When we talked about economic transactions, right? We talked about how gambling is forbidden. We talked about how uncertain transactions that have a high level of uncertainty are not allowed in Islam. Well, what is the ultimate aim behind that? So Muslim scholars have analyzed all these laws together and said the ultimate aim behind that is for the protection of wealth. Well, protection of whose wealth? Protection of wealth for the people who actually possess something, so that it's not being taken away from them very easily. That's why in gambling what happens? People get addicted, people get easily buy into something, and they start losing all their money in a very unjust way, and now they have nothing left. So that's one of the ultimate aims. So there's 5 ultimate aims of the Sharia or in Islamic law that they're designed to do these 5 things. Now if you look at secular laws, particularly Western secular laws, they have similar things, but they really focus on 3 things. They focus on protection of religion. So there's this idea of freedom of religion. No one should stop you from practicing your religion publicly and privately and all of that. So they have that concept, just like Islam has that concept. Protection of property. They have the same thing. So there are certain penalties and punishments for stealing and all of that. Number 3, protection of life. So they have very strict penalties for some murder, for taking somebody's life, and ways to make sure that people are not going to be killed unjustly. So it's protection of life. The 2 things that they really differ with when it comes to Islam and Western or secular society today is there's not very much emphasis on protection of intellect or protection of family or honor. So the thing is, because of the conception of what is right and what is wrong and what is law and what is freedom and all of that, so a law will always restrict a certain amount of freedom that you have. That's the way law works. A law is a restriction of your freedom. So I want to be free to drive as fast as I feel like. I want to drive 120 miles an hour on the freeway, but I'm not allowed to do that. Why? Because there's a law there which restricts me and tells me I cannot exceed 65 miles an hour on the freeway. We'll say, well, why? What's the purpose behind it? The purpose is the protection of other people's lives. Right? The protection of life takes precedence over your freedom or your desire to speed on the freeway, to drive really fast and enjoy yourself. So whenever there's a law, there's a restriction of freedom, but it's for a reason. Right? So in Islam, there are these 2 objectives which are not taken as seriously in Western or secular societies. And that is the protection of intellect and the protection of family. So if you take the protection of intellect, for example, alcohol is prohibited in Islam because your intellect is supposed to be preserved at all times. You should never put yourself in a state of intoxication such that you cannot utilize your intellect in the right way, or make decisions yourself, or do drugs or something like that, so that it impairs your judgment. In American society, for example, or in Dutch society, in Amsterdam or something, you don't have the same concept. The concept is you're free to do whatever you want. It's your mind. You want to mess it up, as long as you're not harming anybody else. The protection of life is still there. It's your intellect. You want to mess it up, you mess it up, that's your problem. You could go and sit there and smoke and whatever you want, inject whatever you want in your own society, and you mess up your brain, you mess up your life. That's not our problem, that's your problem. But in Islam, it says no, this Sharia, this Islamic law that Allah has prescribed, it's Islam's issue. And we're going to make sure that you don't, or people in society are not falling into this trap. So there's protection of intellect by certain laws restricting things which will ruin or mess up your intellect. And likewise, there's the protection of family, or the protection of honor, which again, Western society does not have so much emphasis on. So it's more about individual freedoms over what's going to keep a family or keep the honor of a family together. The family and the honor kind of are paired together. You can describe them, sometimes together. Scholars have kind of grouped them together. So the idea of you having a relationship with anyone you want outside, there's no issue with it in Western society, because the preservation of family is not one of the essential aims or objectives of the society. So that's why I hope you understand the difference between these three. So there's three in secular laws, which are very, very clear, and a lot of laws are built around them. But there's two additional ones. So there's 5 objectives in Islamic law. So hopefully that's clear. That's why you have rules about adultery and fornication in Islam, and you have no rules in secular society. You have rules about drinking and getting high, and you have very restricted rules in a general secular society. So these hudud laws, or these punishments here, these are crimes which must be executed by a legitimate authority, as I've already explained before. But when I say must be executed, they're not optional. So it's something that the legitimate Muslim ruler has to implement these things for the society to be prosperous, or whatever it is. But there are a few things that need to be known in these laws in particular. One of the rules regarding these laws, is hudud laws, are if there's any uncertainty or there's any doubt in the case that's taking place, whether it be a case of fornication or a case of theft or a case of murder, then the judge who's deciding the case should always err on the side of not implementing that punishment. So what does that mean? That means that if you see one of these cases that falls into the category of the hudud laws, or the penal laws, the specific laws, and there's some kind of doubt, what's called shubha, that it's not 100% clear if it happened, but it seems that there's a term in law, right? What's the overriding, probability or whatever? What's the legal term? Anyone know? Yeah, beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So the idea of beyond a reasonable doubt is not applicable in these laws. It should be 100% clear, beyond all doubt, right? So when you have something that's beyond all doubt and it's just 100% clear, the person has been caught in the way which we're going to talk about it, then in that case you implement the punishment. Otherwise, you don't implement these punishments, but you implement another punishment. It's a different punishment. There's still a punishment. So when you have something beyond what we call beyond general doubt or reasonable doubt or whatever, then you implement a punishment, but it's not going to be this punishment. So let me give you an example so that you understand. So let's say somebody steals something and they're caught stealing food, right? And then you go and you find out that in this place there was a famine taking place, or the prices of food were so high that they were recently increased in this area. And this was a very poor family, and they were stealing lots of food, right? So now you don't know, and they stole like a whole truck of food, for example. Now the thing is, there is a level of doubt in this case. Why? Did they steal it because they did not have enough food to eat, or did they steal it because they were planning on selling the truck and making a big profit out of it? Because there's a level of doubt, you're not allowed to implement the punishment on this, because there's what's called a shubha, or a doubt in this case. Another example is if you have 2 people and they're found, I'm going to talk more about adultery and fornication, but imagine you find, or the witnesses find 2 people lying in a hotel room bed, naked, under the covers, right? That generally tells you what? They were committing adultery, right? They're committing fornication. But you're not allowed to implement this punishment for adultery or fornication in something like that, because there's still a level of doubt. Maybe they were about to, but they didn't start. Or maybe, who else knows what in the world they were doing, right? But there's a doubt. So because of that doubt, you're not allowed to implement this punishment. Although you can still implement a discretionary punishment for something along these lines. So we're going to see this in more detail, but I hope it's clear that this idea of not implementing the punishments whenever there's a doubt is there, and that's what the Prophet, peace be upon him, used to implement, and the Muslim scholars have had this general consensus all the time. And the reason why this is so important, this is a very important point, because almost all criticisms of Sharia of Islamic law usually have to do with, there's an underlying idea that this is so unjust, it's so unfair, they just go and grab this random person and they frame the person. Right? So when the person is being framed, or it looked like they did something but in reality they were completely innocent, and innocent people are getting this really harsh punishment on them, or why have such a strict and harsh punishment when someone could potentially be innocent? So therefore all laws and punishments should be very light. They should be light because what if you're punishing innocent people? Well, Islam already took that into consideration by having this principle of whenever there's even the slightest doubt, you're not allowed to implement this punishment. This punishment is only when there's no doubts at all and it's 100% the case is clear as daylight. All right, so that's why that's already been taken into consideration. So that's a very important thing, and that could potentially be an essay question. So just keep that part in mind. It's important you understand this, because this is a common argument. Lastly, these punishments will only apply if the offended party, right, let's say somebody steals something from somebody else. If you take the case to the judge, then this will apply. If you don't take the case to the judge and you caught the person and you took your item back that was stolen, for example, and you did like an out-of-court settlement, right, which we talked about, right? What's it called, out-of-court settlement? Sulh. Right? Negotiated settlement, out-of-court settlement, sulh. Right? So if you do some out-of-court settlement before the case reaches the judge is not required to go and investigate and enforce any type of punishment. So this is only if it makes it to the court. Once it gets to court, now there's no turning back. But if the case never reached the court, there's no responsibility, there's no religious responsibility for the judge to go out and investigate and find out, did any cases of theft happen? Did you guys try and negotiate outside? This is unacceptable. I have a responsibility to make sure that we penalize the thief. That's not the way Islamic law works. So this is a reason why I'm clarifying this. Many people have a misunderstanding. I myself had a misunderstanding that it's a religious obligation for the Muslim ruler or the judge to go and implement the punishment regardless of whether the other person wanted it initially or forgave the person or whatever. That's not the case. Okay? The case is only when it makes it to the judge and to a court of law do you have to implement the law. Okay? So this is important, very important to understand. So if they settled it privately amongst themselves, whatever it was, it stays private and it's not going to be taken, and there's no need to go and investigate like some kind of punishment. So for example, I'll give you an example. So somebody steals someone else's jewelry, all right? You steal someone's jewelry and now all of a sudden you caught the person. The next day you caught them with your jewelry. And then someone goes and puts on Facebook, you know what, that friend of mine, you know, we've been friends for 2 years and she was caught. You know, she stole my jewelry. You know, how does it feel? You know, those Facebook rhetorical, you know, comments, those random epiphanies that people have. You know, how does it feel when your best friend betrays you and stabs you in the back or whatever? Now, all of a sudden, you know, 1 week later, the judge, Muslim judge in a court of law, right? All of a sudden, he's checking, you know, Facebook and he sees that person is his friend and he sees the post, right? Now, is it his responsibility to go and say, hey, it's an Islamic duty now. It's my job now to investigate who was that stole, and we need to make sure that we implement the punishment on them. You can't just, you know, resolve this among yourselves. It's our duty to go and stop this. That's not correct. The judge does not have an Islamic obligation to go and intervene in all of these little things. The judge's responsibility is when cases come to him or her, then they're going to judge what's going to be right and what's going to be wrong. Okay? So let's talk about the first punishment. The first had law is with regards to homicide. When somebody kills somebody else, there can be a number of reasons why they were killed, right? So what happens when someone's killed? One of three things, or more than one of three things, is going to happen. There's going to be an expiation. And we've seen expiation before when we talked about fasting and we talked about different laws. There can be blood money that has to be paid. It's called blood money because it's a large amount of money for the blood or for the death of the person who died. And there can be retaliation. Retaliation means that if you killed someone, you receive the same punishment back, which is that you're also going to die, capital punishment. So homicide can fall into 3 categories. It's called homicide because murder is, when we say murder, it's like something intentional. Homicide is like a police case, right? Determining what really happened. Why did this person die? What's the cause of death? So how did it happen? So number 1 is intentional. So intentional homicide, what we call murder. So when someone is classified as being intentionally murdering another person, this happens when the murderer used something which usually kills a person in order to kill them. So for example, someone used a gun and shot the other person. In Islamic law, the general rule is this is considered to be an intentional murder. You use a knife and you stab somebody else. This is an instrument which usually kills people, right? A knife can kill people, a gun can kill people. So this is considered to be an act of intentional murder. So what's going to happen? What happens is the heirs of the deceased, and we're going to talk about exactly who they are, the heirs of the person that died will choose whether or not they would like to receive blood money as compensation for the death of the person, or they're going to opt for retaliation. So they get to choose, and it's going to be their choice. Now the heirs are the closest family members. Now it's assumed, you would assume in a normal society, that your closest family members who care about you, right, the decision is going to lie in their hands. The general rule should have been retaliation, a life for a life. But now Islam came and made it a little bit easier and said, we're not going to institute a life for a life always. If the closest relatives of the person who died, because they're the ones who are losing that person from their family, if they decide that, you know what, we're willing to have some level of pardon, we're willing to forgive this person who killed our son, or killed our father, or killed our mother, or killed our whatever it is, then in that case they can opt for compensation, but they cannot forgive completely. So you're in a court of law. Now this has been taken to court. So if they say, you know what, we really hate you that you killed my sister, but at the same time, I'm a very forgiving person. I listen to a hadith in the morning after Fajr. I have forgiven and I've removed it from my heart, and you're forgiven. So then the other family, the murderer and everything says, yes, off the hook. Good job, Sheikh. You gave a good hadith about forgiveness or something. Now I'm fine. That's not the way it works. There has to be a blood money that's going to be paid to the family in order to show the seriousness of the case. Okay, so all it means is when you're paying blood money, it doesn't mean you're paying off the penalty of murder. You're not paying off the penalty of murder. It means that you're saving your own life, right? The murderer is saving his own life by having him and all his friends pay this huge penalty of money, because there was a level of forgiveness that the other family showed. So there's a level, an aspect of forgiveness that they showed, but now you can survive. Your life is not going to be taken. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. If you don't understand it that way, then people will come up with all sorts of theories, Oh, you kill someone, and if you're rich, you can just try and bribe them with a bunch of money. That's not the way it works in Islam here. So the closest relatives will choose either retaliation. No, you killed our son, murderer is going to get killed as well. And they have the right to that. Or that there's a level of forgiveness. And in Islam it teaches forgiveness is better. Forgiveness is better, but it's not mandatory on you, right, to do it at this point in time. And just think about it. Imagine someone were to take your closest relative. Are you sure you could forgive at that time? You wouldn't know until it happened. You wouldn't know until, what you're really going through. And it kind of depends on the person too, right? Kind of depends on why they killed the person. Why it was intentional. What was the reason for doing so? So if they opt for compensation, it is paid by the killer, number one. The money is a burden mainly on him, unless they volunteer to help him out or whatever it is. So it's primarily on him, because he is the one who went and killed somebody else. So this is number one. This is called an intentional murder. The second type is an unintentional murder. So when does an unintentional murder take place, or unintentional homicide? It's when the person, he killed somebody by mistake. Like for example, a bunch of people went in the forest and they were hunting together. And accidentally, he was loading his gun and it fired and it killed the person. Or he was going and he was hunting and he saw like a bird, or he saw like, an animal, a deer running through, and all of a sudden he shot and there was another person there and it killed the person. So this is known as unintentional murder. You accidentally killed someone by shooting in the wrong direction, or whatever it is. Another example that they give that's similar to this: you're sleeping and you roll over and you kill somebody's child. You roll on them, you suffocate them to death. Intentional or unintentional? This is unintentional murder, but it's still a murder. Somebody died, right? It's a homicide. Somebody has been killed. So what happens in this case? You have to pay an expiation or perform an expiation from the murderer. So the person who committed this act has to do an expiation, which we're going to talk about. Just keep this in mind. Kafara, expiation. And the blood money for the person who's been killed has to be paid as well, and it comes from your relatives. You and your relatives, all of them are going to come together and they're going to pay the entire huge sum of blood money to the person's family who's been killed. Even though it's unintentional murder, but there are consequences even for something unintentional. The only difference here though is there's no sin. So this person he did it accidentally, so it's not sinful. But there has to be something in place to make it such a serious act that people like this are going to be much more careful and take more precautions so it never happens again. And everyone is going to see that, and they're going to be even more careful. You know what? You better double check everywhere when you're loading your gun. You better make sure no one is in your sight when you're aiming your gun or whatever it is. So you're going to be a lot more careful. So that's why Islam has certain, rules there. Number 3 is what's called semi-intentional murder. So the third category, semi-intentional homicide, is when the murderer or the person who's killing the other person, he attacked the person, but he used something which doesn't normally kill the other person. So for example, you grabbed the book, right? And you literally started beating somebody up with the book, and the guy died, right? Or you're punching him, and you punched him so hard, the guy, punched him a few times, the guy died. Or you punched him, he tripped and he fell and he landed on like a spike or something and he's dead. So is this unintentional or intentional? It's known as semi-intentional because you had the intention to harm the person, but you didn't have the intention to kill the person. So now in this case, what do? Are you going to be killed or are you not going to be killed? Do you have to pay the blood money? What happens? This is similar to the previous one in the sense that expiation is required from the murderer. Number 1. Number 2, the blood money has to be paid from the relatives. And number 3, the person this time is sinful. So the unintentional murder, same rules, but there's no sin on the person because it was 100% unintentional. In this case, same rules apply as the previous case, unintentional, but the person gets sin because they were trying to harm the other person. So the only difference is sin in this case, but the same rulings apply. Okay, so there's 3 types of homicide. Now, when an intentional murderer, somebody who did intentional murder, when they're receiving retaliation, what's going to be happen? How are they going to, get retaliation? They're going to be killed, and in the past they used to use a sword. So they are killed, but without being tortured in any way. So you're not allowed to go and try and, say, well, you shot my brother in both legs and then you killed him. So I want to make sure I'm going to tell the judge that you're going to die the same way. You're going to die along the same way. That's not allowed in Islam. So the way that the other person is going to be killed is going to be straight death. So what methods or what techniques, that's actually very open. However they die, the point is to get their life is going to be over if retaliation is opted for. Okay, so whatever techniques that they're going to be using. But techniques like American, one of the things why we have such a bad taste in our mouth about capital punishment is look how it was applied, like in America, right? Like the electric chair. Has anyone actually watched an electrocution take place in a fictional movie or anything like that? Yeah, it's like a fictional. It's gruesome, right? Even when I was a kid, we used to watch like really bad, movies like Nightmare on Elm Street and all that stuff. One movie we watched one day, we just brought this thing up. My mom knows. We watched it. We literally couldn't even finish the movie. It was so bad, right? And it's gruesome. So one of the things people say, oh, this is so barbaric and it's so this and so. Islam is not saying that you go and you start electrocuting someone, or you start, putting little, needles in their body or whatever it is. So keep that in mind. So when it comes to something along these lines, this type of murder, this type of retaliation is without the person being tortured. What is the blood money? The blood money at that time was equivalent to 100 camels. 100 camels. Now that's a lot of money. Does anyone know how much a camel costs nowadays? I actually tried to look it up. There's such a range on camels. There's so many different types. But like the cheapest one I could find, good, decent quality camel, was about like $5,000. These are expensive camels. All right? So 100. Huh? No, not the red ones, man. These are the cheap ones. So, I mean, they have them in California is known for its camel, by the way, right? They have camels in California because California we forgot that it's a desert, right? And in fact, what we don't know is that, they were actually Ottoman Empire cavalry, or Ottoman Empire actually sent a group of special camel forces that were employed by the U.S. military in California that they were using for a while. Then they disbanded that unit. But this camel is very important. Anyways, so 100 camels. So let's say a camel is, $3,000. That's $300,000. If each camel is $500,000, that's $500,000. That's a lot of money. That's why the entire family has to put up the money for this. It used to be equivalent at that time to 1,000 gold dinars. 1,000 gold dinars, or 10,000 silver dirhams, or it was equal to 200 cows. All right, so now how you're going to calculate today, there's probably some, modern council of scholars who figured out the best way to calculate today, but because this punishment is not being implemented, there's no need to go into the detail. How much a cow costs, by the way? A cow's like $1,000, right? Good cow's $1,000. So 200 cows is $200,000 at least. So it gives you a kind of a figure. We're talking about between $100,000 to $500,000 approximately. Right? So that's about the range we're talking about. So it's a large sum of money. This is not something to be taken, lightly. This is the blood money amount. For the unintentional and for the semi-intentional murder, it's paid by the nearest inheriting relatives, nearest male inheriting relatives. So there's one of the criticisms that we find on Islamic law has to do with why males in the same line get more than females in the same line when it comes to inheritance, which we're going to address next week. But one of the things to keep in mind, if you can remember it until next week when we discuss it in more detail, is that who's going to be paying for this penalty as well? It's the males. So they're going to be paying, and they're going to be financing, the family and all of that. So it's the males who are responsible in this case for paying. So who are the nearest male inheriting relatives? It's the father, the sons, the brothers, the uncles, the nephews, and the first cousins. Basically anyone where between you, if you were the killer, between you and the other person, there's no more than 2 links in between. All right, so when you talk about a brother, how many people are in between you and the brother? How many people are in between? Your parents are in between. By direct blood. It goes through your parents, right? So one of your parents, and then so there's one person in between you. When it comes to your uncle, how many people in between you and your uncle? All right, alhamdulillah, you're right. So there's 2. And in terms of nephews, same thing, right? Brother and father, okay. And first cousins, how many people in between then? 3, okay. So correct that rule. Up to 3 in between. Okay, up to 3 in between. All right. Good. So these are the people who are responsible. So they all need to get together and they need to pool all their money together, take some loans or whatever it is, and pay on your behalf. As well as you need to put your own money up. Because this is the way, families are supposed to be functioning. They help each other out, and this is what their responsibility is. They're trying to bail you out, right? They're trying to save you in the first place. If they're not going to do it and they don't care about you, what's going to happen to you? Retaliation. You're gone. All right? So you should be very nice to your family in Islamic society, right? You should be very nice and kind to your family such that they'll actually bail you out in case you do something. Otherwise, they're going to leave you and say, well, you go and retaliate with this guy. It's not a problem. My Mercedes is priority in my life for me, right? So you need to take that into account. So you see the wisdom behind it though, right? You can understand how a functional family is going to result in one thing, is going to result in more mercy and pardon and people helping out the family. And a dysfunctional family is going to lead to other problems. So all of these things about preservation of life and preservation of family and honor, they mix together. So sometimes they come together. The expiation now. So the murderer is responsible for doing what? Expiation is to free a believing slave. So before, when we talked about expiation, we didn't say believing slave. It didn't have to be a believer. It didn't have to be a Muslim. It could have been any slave. But in this case, it has to be a Muslim slave in particular. Okay? And if you're not able to do that, then you have to fast for 2 months straight. That's 60 days without break. And if you break one day in between, as we saw before, what do? Start again from the beginning and you do another 60 days. Right? So it's very strict penalty even for something like unintentional murder. Okay? Now retaliation, as we mentioned, can be dropped if any of the nearest relatives of the deceased forgive the murderer or they're content with the monetary compensation. Now what if some of them say, hey, you know what? Yeah, let him die. And the other ones say, no, we should bail him out. We should forgive the murderer and, whatever it may be. So if the relatives are differing, or let's say some of the relatives are away, they're on a business trip, they're not checking their email right now, and the case is in court, what do? You have to wait until they come back or they can be reached. The case will be postponed because everyone has to agree. Okay, everyone has to agree to accept, otherwise, there's not going to be retaliation. If more than one person participates in a murder, what happens now? Because we said one person was murdered and 4 people participated in the murder of the person. So would you take potentially 4 lives for 1 life? Is that fair? I see absolutely, of course it is. Right? I see no's as well. They deserve it. They did it. That's right. It wouldn't be, what else are you going to do? You're going to take 1/4 of their life? Each 1 limb goes off or something like that? No. So yes, if anyone who's responsible for a murder because they had a direct hand in doing that, they also are potentially prone to retaliation or blood money. So that means 4 blood monies will go if all 4 of them were being forgiven by the family. So everyone's going to be responsible for that. If somebody forces another person to commit murder, so usually whenever we talk about force in Islam, right? If somebody forces you to do this or forces you to do that, usually you're not held responsible in Islam. This is clear hadith, the Prophet, peace be upon him. So you're not going to be held responsible if you're forced. Like children are not held responsible. People who are insane, they're not held responsible. But in this case, if you were forced to commit murder, then you are considered a full murderer and you can receive retaliation. Why? Because when you were forced to kill somebody else, what was the opposite option? You tried to save your life by taking somebody else's life. A family can be a different case. So if they threaten your entire family, then the judge will decide that. But let's say somebody just threatens you in particular, and it's your life on the line, and you go and take somebody else's life in return for that. In that case, you are going to get, you're going to be potentially prone to retaliation. Because usually if somebody threatens your life, says, you know what, I'm going to kill you if you don't drink this alcohol. Okay, you're not going to be punished in the same way, or you're not going to get a punishment if it's proven that you were forced to do so. But in this case, because what's at stake with the threat is your life. And in order to save your life, you have to take somebody else's life. You're not excused from this. Okay? And lastly, when a leader orders somebody to kill another person unjustly, right? The question is, we're talking about like soldiers, soldiers in an army. And this is very common for Muslims who go in a military or something like that. It's a common question. If your leader commands you to kill somebody unjustly, the innocent person, they didn't do anything wrong, and you know that, and you still go and you kill them anyways. The question is, because obeying orders, assuming it's a Muslim leader as well, you're supposed to obey orders, that's your job, or are you held responsible for that? Such that if there's a government overthrow, let's say there's a coup, now a new government comes in, and the family points you out as a soldier and says, that's the one who killed my brother, who was unarmed, he was innocent, he wasn't doing anything else, he wasn't in a military combatant or something. Can the had punishment be applied to you because you were following orders? Yes. Yes, it can. Why? That means that Muslims have an independent moral responsibility as well. So when they know, this is similar to the previous case, what's going to happen to you if you fail to follow orders? They'll kill you. But to save your own life, you're going to kill somebody else? You are putting yourself up for the had punishment of retaliation as well. Because you decided that your life is more valuable than the other person's life. Therefore, you are also going to be subject to this. And this is a very contemporary issue. Now, it's not a controversial issue, it's a contemporary issue. Right, because it's happening on a regular basis. So that's murder. I'm going to try and finish this class early today because I know people want to go to the conference. Next is banditry. Banditry known as muharaba. Banditry is specifically, according to the Hanafi school of thought, banditry is specifically when you threaten people with weapons that can kill, right? Not with like the water bottle or something. When you threaten somebody with weapons that can kill in a deserted area, such as a forest, a desert, on sea, like, pirates of the Caribbean or whatever, they jump in there and they pull out the swords and they're literally threatening other people. Now the question is, what's the difference between this and the other one? Here, when you're a pirate or you're a bandit, you're threatening people in a region which is deserted, right? In the sea or in the desert or in a forest or something like that. The reason why this crime is specific and different from the other crimes is because usually there are no people around and there's no police around that can help you. So they're basically taking advantage of your vulnerability in this region where there can be no one that's going to be helping you. So this is a bigger crime. And what does it lead to? It leads to entire groups of people. The whole society is scared to travel now. Their whole life is restricted. Imagine someone was traveling through, forest or something and they got killed. And you want to go through the forest now? Whoa, wait a minute. Last 3 families that went through there, they got killed. Now your crime is greater than a crime that is committed inside a city where, at least somebody could have come and helped you, or there could have been some police, or they could have got easily caught. So this is known as the crime of banditry. So it's worse and there's more punishments for this than there are for other crimes. So the crime for banditry is, if the bandits murder somebody, in this case, they are killed in retaliation and there is no blood money. So they're killed in retaliation and they're crucified. Okay? Crucified does not mean crucified like we understand the Christian Jesus crucifixion. That's not what it means, nailing the hands to the wall. No, crucifixion actually meant, even the whole idea of the cross, by the way, the Jehovah's Witnesses and stuff, they don't even believe that the cross was the cross. Crucifix, when you crucify someone, it means you put their body up for a period of time to display them in front of other people. So it used to be that you either tie their body to a tree or you tie their body to a pole or something like that to show people for a day or for 2 days, to show this was a punishment which was so bad, this person has done something so bad, if you try to do something like this, you better be careful. So this person is publicly displayed for like a day or something like that after they're killed, to make sure that any other pirates, any other bandits who are going and thinking about doing this to other people, they're going to change their mind and say, this is the penalty of what you're doing. So now the thing is, Muslim scholars actually very funny how they think. So they were debating, they said, you know what? Do we put the person up first and have him displayed for like a day and then we execute him? Or do we execute him first and then put him up on display? So one group of scholars, the Shafi'i scholars, for example, they have an interesting argument. They said, no, this is haram because the person is still a Muslim. He has to pray 5 times a day. So if he's tied to a tree, how is he going to pray? So I said, no, we need to kill him first and then we put him up so he can't miss any prayers. That was their interesting discussion that they had. Because from the Islamic perspective, if it's a Muslim who's doing this and they're being executed, are they being killed as a kafir? Are they being killed as a non-Muslim? No. Are they prayed over with janazah? Yes. Are they being buried as a Muslim and washed? Yes. So it's not like this is, this person is like removed from the community or society or something like that. You start cursing the person. No. This is actually considered part, if the person is sorry for what they've done, this is considered part of their repentance, if they're sorry for what they've done. So just keep that in mind. Now if somebody steals, we haven't talked about stealing yet, most of you know about the cutting the hand. If somebody steals during a bandit raid, the punishment is different. The punishment is that their right hand and their left foot will be amputated. Both. This is the punishment for stealing twice. So even though they stole once, they get the punishment for stealing twice. Because, why? They took advantage of people in the deserted areas. Right? So it's banditry. And whoever frightens, so there's 3 things usually bandits can do. Either they're going to kill people, or they're going to rob people, or at minimum, they're going to frighten people. Right? Meaning like they scare them with weapons and everything, and then they decide not to kill them for whatever reason. Right? So if the bandits frighten people, but they didn't harm them or steal from them, they're banished from the land. They're kicked out of the land for a certain period of time. And that period of time is going to be decided by the ruler. Okay, so that's their punishment. They're exiled, right, for a certain period of time. So these are the rules for banditry. And they're very harsh because they're taking advantage of people in this weak situation. The next had punishment is punishment for adultery and fornication. What's the difference between adultery and fornication? Does anybody know? If they're married, it's adultery. If they're not married, it's fornication. Okay, so both of them have a punishment. So why is there a punishment for adultery and fornication? Because this person has violated the honor of the other person. We talked about the importance of family. They violated the honor of the other person, and they've destroyed the fabric of society, which is the family. So this, fornication and adultery, it destroys the family. Now in Western society, we look at it from the perspective of, as long as they're 2 consenting adults, that's all that matters. As long as both of them agree, that's sufficient. But what doesn't matter for them is, well, what does their family think? Right? Their family doesn't matter what the family thinks. Right? So now, if you're in the position where you're inclining towards committing fornication, and the other person is inclining towards committing fornication, you're not going to be able to understand the detailed wisdom behind this. But imagine now, you're in a circumstance where you have a sister, or you have a daughter, right? And now you say, well, my daughter is consenting with this guy, and this guy is consenting with her. How do you feel about it? Now you can understand a little bit more about the wisdom, right? It's not just about your consent. This is gonna ruin your honor. It's not just about reputation. It's honor in the sense that this is an uncommitted relationship. And I've explained this already before. The difference between a relationship outside of marriage and a relationship inside of marriage is, the only difference is, one is a committed relationship, committed meaning a binding committed relationship, and the other one is a, I promise I'm always going to love you relationship, but you break up tomorrow. You say, well, what happened to the promise yesterday? Well, I didn't meet Jennifer, and she just happens to, be prettier than you are. And, oh, well, I met Bill also, and Bill is cooler than you are, so therefore, you know what, we're not in love anymore. We just went in love with the other person. That's the difference between committed and uncommitted relationship. So anyways, that's why most Westerners, and that we're Westerners as well, okay? But most Westerners who don't have, who are not Muslim, it's very difficult for them to understand why there would be any penalty for fornication. They can understand adultery. Because for adultery, there's married couple, and it's like, oh, you lied to the other person. Okay, I can understand that. But when it comes to fornication, it's not something that they're going to be able to understand, because they're not looking at it from the same perspective. The perspective for them is just between two consenting adults, and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter. Anything else doesn't matter. So it's important to understand why this is and why people have a difficult time with this. For fornication, you say there should be imagine if you were to put a $50 penalty on fornication in America, you would have a section of society just complaining like crazy. So the main problem is not with the severity of the punishment. The first problem is that why should there be a punishment for fornication in the first place? Then people have an issue with the severity. So you need to be very clear. When someone's complaining and saying, well, why do you have such a harsh punishment for fornication, harsh punishment for adultery? The real issue at hand, first of all, is why should you even have a punishment in the first place? And second comes, well, why is it so harsh? Because they need to understand the principles and the objectives. And there's a lot of propaganda involved. You have to understand, whether you like it or not, we've all received some of the propaganda. Who's read Scarlet Letter? It's a well-known, who's heard of the Scarlet Letter? Anyone know the story? No? You guys don't know? Okay, anyone who lived in the 90s, went to school in the 90s, had to read this book. It's absolutely required. Right? So this is part of the propaganda against an adulterer, where a woman had to have this giant A placed on her because she was committed for adultery. And the whole story is dramatized because it shows how, the pastor or the priest or whatever was, they had a relationship, blah, blah, whatever happened. When you dramatize something and you show that this person they weren't so bad, it wasn't so bad, and, it's not such a bad thing, and look how society treated her and everything, it just gives more fuel to the fire of this whole idea of European dark ages, middle ages, backward society and everything. So people apply that baggage or that understanding trauma that they have, and they start applying it on Islam. So anyways, just keep that in mind when you're trying to at least get to grips with this idea. What else does fornication do? Fornication and adultery can lead to children not knowing their own lineage. Okay, so this is, we say, oh, well, we have birth control and stuff like that. First of all, birth control doesn't work 100% of the time. And second, not every person in the world has access to birth control. So this idea that, oh, well, everyone's like American society, it's not the same thing. Even if you find many people having children out of wedlock. So what does it do? It leads to children not knowing their lineage, because when they have a child out of wedlock, oftentimes that, what's known as the children of adultery, usually that's an uncommitted relationship. So usually they just leave. So imagine you're committing fornication with this person, fornication with this person. If you didn't have DNA testing available to you, which most of the world does not have available, we assume that it's available everywhere. No, it's available everywhere, maybe in the United States of America, not in the most of the world. So if you didn't have that testing available, or you couldn't find who the person who impregnated you in the first place was, what's going to happen to this child? You won't even know who the father is. So you don't even know who your own father is. So that's another thing that fornication and adultery lead to. Another thing is, it leads to children being abandoned, oftentimes. Because if there's an uncommitted relationship, if you weren't committed to the relationship, why would you be committed to raising up a child, which takes so much work and so much time? So these are some of the problems of fornication and adultery. Anyway, so how do you establish the crime? How do you establish the crime of adultery or fornication, and what happens? So first of all, you can establish the crime through two ways: through witnesses or through confession. So through witnesses, you need to have 4 upright witnesses that are willing to testify in a court of law that they saw with their own eyes the couple fornicating. Not heard, or not saw a tweet, or not saw a Facebook post or something like that, that they actually saw the act itself. Okay? The witnesses, when they're testifying, if they're going to testify, they need to be very clear on their intention that they're not doing it, as a grudge against the person or whatever it is. They're doing it for the sake of Allah, for the cause of Allah, because this is something that's going to protect the society. Now, they have to have seen the act itself, right? Like I mentioned before, not just two people in a bed together, or two people, I saw them walk into the hotel room together. And 1 hour later, I saw them walk out. That is not sufficient. You have to actually see the act itself. All right? So, what does that mean? If something like this happened, it means that the act was done in a public way. It was done in public such that 4 people were actually watching it take place. Right? If that's even rare, it's so rare that it's almost impossible that it would even happen, something like that. Generally in a society where, you'd find a lot of Muslims or upright witnesses, very rare that you would see it. So in that case, if you say, well, what's the point of this punishment then? Like, who in the world, has anyone ever heard of anyone in their whole life, anyone they know, any distant person, ever having 4 witnesses catching someone in adultery? Anyone ever read about it in history, that these 4 witnesses that you'd read an incident, 4 witnesses caught this couple doing this? I've never come across one. It's almost impossible to find in a somewhat decent community, right? It's very, very, very difficult to find. So what does that mean? So if it's so impossible, then why did Islam put such restrictions like this? What's the point then? It doesn't make sense. How could 4 witnesses, right, be in a place where they're watching 2 people actually in the act of fornication or adultery? Where in the world? How is that going to happen, right? With pornography, yeah, but we're talking about, outside of recording. Pornography, but before that. This has been 1400 years ago. It's been implemented before cameras and all of that. Outside of that, where would you find it? Right? Or maybe in a prostitution house or something like that. Otherwise, very, very difficult to establish. So what that means is, it means that this punishment for adultery in the first place was more of a theoretical deterrent rather than a practical deterrent. It was not something where people are actually being caught and being, told or stuff like that. You don't find that in history. What you find is, this is a theoretical thing to make sure that people are afraid of committing adultery in the first place, number 1. And number 2, that if it ever happened, it's going to be as private and secluded as possible so that it doesn't affect the rest of the community, the rest of the society. So then the question is, if that's the case, has the punishment for adultery or fornication ever been implemented? If no one has ever had 4 witnesses, has it ever been implemented? Yes, it has. So how did it get implemented? All right? It's a question. So how did it get implemented? One of 2 ways. Either through confession or through a false implementation of the law. And what you find in the past, there was confession. Right? Because you got to be pretty crazy to confess, to get the punishment on you. Not crazy, but you got to be really sincere and really brave, and it's very rare that someone's going to have something like that. Number 1. Number 2, most of the punishments that we find taking place in this place or whatever, they don't say it was a result of confession. Because what they show, and you see this all the time, you see Western media going and taking one incident of someone being killed or whatever it is, and they say, this poor person or this poor woman, usually it's always a woman being shown, all right? This poor woman, she's, she went and, she just had a good time and, or there was a false accusation against her. She didn't even do anything wrong. And look, these people, they're putting the punishment on her and she's saying, I'm so sorry, please don't do this to me and all of that. How does that fit in with any of this? It doesn't fit in, right? Because either she acknowledged 100% that she did it, or 4 witnesses actually saw it, and you really have 4 proper witnesses, which you never find in that story of what's taking place, right? Or she is being unjustly, or he or whoever it is being unjustly having this punishment inflicted upon them because they're not following the actual law. So that's something to keep in mind. So second is confession. So now, if you confess though, the person who's confessing to committing adultery must declare that they performed adultery or fornication in clear language. So you have to say it clearly that I did it 100%. And it's recommended for the judge. So the judge's responsibility, when the person comes and says, I committed adultery, the judge should say, they should try to convince the person to retract the testimony against themselves. Because this is exactly what the Prophet, peace be upon him, did. So the Prophet, when someone came to him, the Prophet said, are you crazy? Like, first of all, the person was saying, I did this. He said, I think you're crazy, right? The first thing they asked was, are you sure? Maybe you were just kissing. He said, no, I did it. So maybe you were just touching. He said, no, I'm clear, I did it. He looked at the other guy, is this guy crazy? This guy must be crazy. He said, no, he's not crazy. He's a normal, sane person and everything. But, he wanted to confess himself. So the thing is, this is a guy named Ma'iz, very well-known story, that this guy tried to confess to his crime. And the Prophet kept sending him away and sending him back and saying, no, you probably you kissed, right? But you didn't, go all the way. He said, no. So this guy, so he's sending the guy away and saying, you know what, no, don't worry about it. So this guy came and confessed against himself. Now, the thing is, what does that tell you? It tells you that if you did commit adultery. Now, do Muslims commit adultery and fornication? Of course they do. Of course they do. Now, if you're a practicing, sincere Muslim and you fell into the trap and you did it, and let's say you live in a full Muslim society where they're going to be implementing these laws. Is it your Islamic obligation to go and confess to the judge to get purified? It's not. It's not an obligation, number one. And from the Prophet's statement, we learn, number two, it's not even recommended. Because what you would expect is, you would think that it's just something recommended. I've done something so wrong, I need to ask Allah for forgiveness. And when someone is very sincere, they're going to say, I'm willing to take whatever punishment is needed. This punishment in this world is better than the punishment in the hellfire. So I would rather be purified in this world. Now that's a sincere person, sincere intention, kind of makes sense. But from the Sharia perspective, the Islamic law perspective, the person, if it was done privately, it was not done publicly, there were no witnesses or anything, Allah has concealed that person's faults. They should just keep it themselves. They're not supposed to go and turn themselves in. That's not their Islamic obligation. It's not something that's recommended for them. So then the question is, if it's not recommended for them, and it's not required for them, and it's so hard to get 4 witnesses, how is it that the punishment was actually inflicted on someone in the past through their own admission? Right? And the answer is not too difficult to come up with, is that if somebody turns themselves in publicly, right, and you try to convince them and you say, no, maybe you just did this. No, this is what I did and this is how I did and this is who I did it with and everything. And this is a public confession around people. If you don't implement the punishment, what's the law going to be? The law is a joke. The law becomes a joke, right? So that's why the punishment was inflicted upon certain people who confessed. And this is the only way it's really happened, especially in the early period of Islam where we look to as an example. This is the only way it ever happened. When people came, confessed, insisted that it happens, insisted that they want to let everyone know of what they've done. In that case, the punishment was inflicted upon them. Right? Otherwise, it's going to be like, no, you know what? The law was only theoretical. We didn't mean it at all. Then what's the point of the deterrent then, right? Now you've made a joke out of the law. It's not going to work. So that's what happened. Now if the fornicator, so what's the punishment? I'll try and move faster. If the fornicator was not married, then they receive 100 lashes from a whip. Okay, from a whip. So keep the whip in mind, because there's going to be something else coming up. And it's a painful punishment, but the person is spared. If the adulterer was married, then they're put to death by stoning. Okay, they're put to death by stoning. Now the question is, why is it that the punishment for the adulterer is more than the punishment for the fornicator? For a number of reasons. The reason number one is because in adultery, you were married. So you had the opportunity to legitimately fulfill your desires in a lawful way. Right? Whereas the temptation that the other person is generally going to be having who's not in a marriage relationship, it's tougher. Right? Because they're not committed to anyone, they don't have, they're not married yet or whatever it is. That's number one. And number two, that's an act of treachery against their spouse. So they went and not only lied, but they've gone behind the back of their own spouse and went and cheated with somebody else. Number two. And number three, this could have interfered with the lineage of their children as well. So take, for example, for a woman who's going to go and cheat on her husband, what happens is if she's having a relationship with her husband, and now she goes and has a relationship with another man, and they're from the same, they're from, let's say, tribal community or whatever. Now all of a sudden, she's pregnant. Whose child is she pregnant with? You see the problem? Major problem. Right? And like I said before, it's very easy to say, well, we have tests for that and everything. Not always. Not every society has access to tests. And not only that, let's say the husband never caught her. The husband never caught her that she was cheating. And she didn't even realize that the child she had was not the child of her own husband. It was a child from somebody else. How would you tell if you wouldn't even know to do a test? You say, well, the guy, my husband, he has blonde hair. And the guy I cheated on, he also cheated on, with, he also has blonde hair. And the child comes out with blonde hair and, features that resemble kind of mix of her and some other people. How would you tell? Very difficult, right? Imagine what this would do to society. This is a huge issue. So that's the reason why it's a harsher penalty. The next one is a subcategory of adultery, and that is what's known as li'an. Li'an is the curse of slanderous accusation against your own spouse. Okay, so this happens in a certain way. So I'm going to go really fast through this, so just pay attention. If a man or a wife, let's say a man or vice versa, accuses his wife of adultery, right? But he doesn't have evidence. He doesn't have 4 witnesses. And now he's thinking, how I can't live with this person anymore. How am I supposed to, how can I saw it myself, but I don't have witnesses. So how can I prove that this actually happened? So what does he do in this case? In this case, he's supposed to do a special procedure which is known as li'an. He swears 4 times on oath by Allah that he's telling the truth. And the 5th time, he calls down the curse of Allah, the curse of Allah upon himself if he's lying. And this is in a court of law. Now, this is an exception to the rule because if you saw your spouse doing something and you don't have witnesses, to this, you can't take this anymore. You can't live like this anymore. It's for sure, if you're accusing your own spouse of committing adultery, and you're saying that I saw them 100% without a doubt that they were committing adultery, and the other person denies it, for a fact, one of them is lying. Right? One of them is lying. Either the one who's accusing is lying, or the one who supposedly committed adultery is lying. So this process is to figure out which one is lying, and if none of them want to give up their right, then they're going to be separated. And this is a form of divorce in Islam. So this is how it happens. Okay? The judge calls in both spouses, reminds both of them, all right? Reminds both of them, not just one. Remember, if whichever one of you is lying, whichever one of you is lying, remember that Allah is forgiving. You should stop lying. You should take your statement back. Because one person made a statement, my spouse has committed adultery. And the other spouse made the statement, this person is lying against me, I never did such a thing. One of them is lying. Which one? So the judge reminds both of them. Remember, Allah is forgiving. Before we start this process, you should get out of court, resolve this among yourselves, and just go about your daily life. If they say no, both of them agree and say no, none of us are changing our statement. We're sticking to our statement. Then the judge tells the husband, I want you to say 4 times. And he repeats after him, I testify by Allah that I am speaking the truth about the adultery of which I have accused my wife, or vice versa. If, now the judge has reminded him, If the man or the woman, if the man refuses to bear witness to this, the judge will order that he is detained until he either admits, or until he either swears or he admits that he was lying. The point is this: if you're being told to swear by Allah, it kind of reminds you, even if you're a liar, maybe it reminds you that, you know what, I'm swearing by Allah now, I better take this more seriously. It's hope that you're going to stop. If the person stops or admits, okay, he says it 3 times, and the 4th time, you know what, I'm swearing by Allah. Okay, fine. I don't like my wife. I just don't want to be married to her, and my family pressure is coming here and coming there, and I just wanted to get away from her. And I hate her, and I hate her guts, and she always leaves her socks on the floor or something like that, and just drove me crazy, so I wanted to put this lie in there. So what happens to the guy? The guy is going to be punished with 80 lashes of the whip for falsely accusing his wife, or vice versa. If the husband testifies, right, then the judge reminds him one more time after 4 testimonies, remember that when you make this last statement, you're going to invoke Allah's curse on you, which will most likely lead you to go to hellfire. So this is something, and he reminds him that, you know what, punishment in this world is lighter than punishment in the next life. If the guy changes his mind, he gets 80 lashes. If he doesn't change his mind, he repeats after the judge, I invoke Allah's curse upon myself if I'm telling a lie. This is the worst thing you could ever do. The worst dua, you're making dua against yourself, that you want Allah to curse you. I mean, this is the worst thing you could ever do, so you better not be lying if you do something like this. Then the judge goes to the wife, and now it's the wife's turn. And he says, you say 4 times, you swear by Allah that your husband is lying, that this never really happened. So she says it 4 times, or she can retract. If she retracts, she gets 80 lashes of the whip for falsely lying to her husband. Okay. Then he reminds her of the same thing. He said, remember, you're going to be putting the curse of Allah on yourself. So now is the time to retract if you want to retract. If she doesn't retract, she swears that she brings Allah's wrath upon herself if he's telling the truth. Right? If he's telling the truth. And what happens after this? If the whole proceeding goes through, he bears witness 4 times and curses himself, and she bears witness 4 times and curses herself, then the 2 of them are separated. They're not allowed to remain married to each other. They're separated. It counts as one final divorce. According to Imam Abu Yusuf, one of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, he said not only is it a final divorce, you cannot retract this divorce, they can never ever be married to each other no matter what happens. Even if she marries another person, they come back 20 years later, they say, we're so sorry, we love each other, and this and that. They can never be married ever again because of the seriousness of what happened, even if they wanted to. So if the accusation of adultery has to do with the pregnancy that the husband is denying, the husband is saying she committed adultery and this is not even my child, then after they do this process, the attribution of the child cannot be to the father anymore, and that father is not considered the father of the child. It's negated officially in terms of records and all of that. Okay. Next is false accusation of adultery. Okay, false accusation of adultery is when somebody goes and accuses somebody else through a statement of adultery. So say, man, you adulterer, or you zani, or whatever it is, or calls somebody bastard child, for example, saying, this is what you are. This is a major sin, to accuse somebody of adultery in order to damage their reputation or to cause them, some kind of psychological harm. So Islam has put this harsh punishment on people to prevent them from accusing. So Islam puts restrictions to prevent adultery from happening, and it also puts restrictions to prevent accusations of adultery. So this falls under which category? Protection of life or property, honor and family, right? Because if you have somebody accusing you of adultery, and your family, or fornication or whatever, and your family is listening to this, and they're having doubts about you, and your husband is having doubts about you, or your wife is having doubts about you, what society is that going to lead to? So all of these Star magazines, Inquirer magazines and stuff, they'll be getting a lot of lashes, because they keep accusing everyone of adultery everywhere, left, right, and center, right? So these yellow journalism magazines. So the slanderer gets 80 lashes. One punishment is whoever slanders like this gets 80 lashes, so that they're never going to go and talk like this again. And number two, they will never be allowed to serve as a witness in the future ever again, in any case, any court case. Their witness is rejected forever. Now this latter punishment of having your witness rejected forever, it doesn't even apply to the person who's committing fornication. So you commit fornication, you get 100 lashes or whatever, you ask Allah for forgiveness, 5 years later, you testify to someone stealing or whatever it is, your testimony can be accepted in a court of law. You've changed yourself. When it comes to a slanderer, their testimony will never be accepted, because the crime that they've committed is so bad, it's not going to be, their status will not change in society. So how does it happen? This also happens if somebody accuses someone of adultery and cannot bring 4 witnesses. So this whole idea of the 4 witnesses seeing, right, when we said it's theoretical, it can never really happen and everything, it's interlinked with an understanding of this slander. So somebody comes and says, me and my 2 friends, we saw this person in the act and everything. You say, well, where's the 4th witness? Say, no, I'm telling you, we all saw it. We don't have a 4th person who can testify or whatever. This is with the assumption that you don't have a bunch of liars living in your community. Everyone's just a liar willing to testify falsely or whatever it is. This goes hand in hand with that. So if somebody steals, what's the punishment for theft? Stealing is defined as, and this is a very important definition, stealing something which you do not own, it's of a specific value, it's been stored in a secure place, and you stole it through a secretive ploy. So there's 4 conditions when you consider something to be theft. So the punishment of this punishment for this type of theft is amputation of the hand at the wrist. Okay? Now the value of the item must be of a significant value. So if you steal something just randomly, like a fruit or a book or a trash can or something really small, not considered to be of any major value, then this punishment is not going to be applied. Does that mean no punishment will be applied? No. You have a discretionary punishment. So does that mean that, if you steal candy bar from a store, oh, well that's so small, so there's no punishment, the hand doesn't get cut, so then Muslims are allowed to go and steal and there's no punishment? No, that goes back to discretionary punishment. So I want you to understand, in the beginning we talked about the difference between discretionary punishment and had punishment. Discretionary punishment can be on anything else that you need to order society, and you're allowed flexibility in that. But the had punishment is specific. So in this case, it's a discretionary punishment. Alright? Now, the number 2 part of the definition was, it must be stored in a safe place. Like it should be in a house, right? Or it should be in a store. Or it should be in a box or someplace, rather than some public place like the masjid. If somebody leaves something in the masjid and it's stolen from the masjid and it's not locked down, it's just kind of sitting there and you take it, the had punishment is not applied. There's a punishment that should be applied, but it's not the same punishment that's going to be applied. You go into somebody's garden, you start stealing, their fruits, or you steal, something just kind of lying there, right? You steal like their lawnmower or something like that. This is not the same type of punishment. You can't apply the had punishment for that because it doesn't fit the definition. Because it's a public space. One of my teachers brought up an interesting example. In many Muslim countries, the masjid door is very nice. If someone were to steal, I think he said actually it happened. Somebody once stole the door of the masjid. It was very nice and decorated and everything. And their hand was not cut off. Because that's considered public property and it's right there in front of everyone. So it's interesting. But don't steal our doors, okay? Do not steal our doors, please. No, the chandelier, don't take the chandelier. Don't steal anything in the masjid. But a discretionary punishment will apply. So what does that tell you? It tells you something very important. It tells you that the punishment for theft is not only due to the loss of property of the other person, but what is it instead? This rule that I just talked to you about, public space versus private space and locked, secure and all that, what does it tell you about? What is the underlying reason of the punishment? Protection of private spaces. That's very important. So the protection of private spaces, because once your private space becomes invaded, what happens in the society? Society starts panicking, right? Somebody broke into my house, somebody did this, somebody did that. It's different than if you left your lawnmower, right? And then you go inside the house, you go on a phone call and all of a sudden somebody takes it. It's very different than them going and breaking into your house and taking it, right? So what it does to society is very important. So that kind of gives you the philosophy behind the punishment. It's compromising safe places. And that causes more disruption in society. Now there are some small rules. This is not too important, but we talked about shubha, right? The doubt. So whenever there's some kind of doubt, the punishment is not going to be inflicted. So what the scholars have said is, and this does not mean it's okay to steal, okay, from these people. If a child was caught stealing from the parents, or if the parents were caught stealing from the child, or if one spouse was caught stealing from another spouse, usually, not always, but usually the judge will not enforce the had punishment. Why? Because it's generally assumed that if you're going to steal from your own family, you have some form of right or authority over access to that money. They're going to be spending on, your family's spending on each other, right? Families always cooperate with one another. They're spending on each other. They're buying each other food and everything. So if you were to steal in that case, the judge usually looks at it and says, that's a level of doubt. Maybe the person thought it was their own type of money or whatever it is. Unless, of course, they're confessing 100% that, I hate my family and I try to steal all their money. It's different. But usually the judge will look at that as something different. So whenever there's some kind of doubt, I'll give you an example, a very important example. In the time of Umar, radiallahu anh, may Allah be pleased with him, second Khalifa, there was a famine that took place for an entire year. And during the famine time, he stopped implementing this punishment. So people were coming and, this person stole this box and this person stole that other thing. And very valuable things like food and stuff. But why were they stealing? So even if they stole an item, he said, we're not going to be implementing this punishment this year because it's due to famine. So how do we know that this person didn't steal the item so they could sell the item in order to get food because there's no food available to them? So he stopped the punishment in this time because of this doubt that took place. So if there's a level of doubt in a certain society or region or whatever reasons, then that's considered a doubt. You don't apply the same punishment. But do you apply any punishment for stealing? Yes, you do. You apply discretionary punishment. It doesn't mean you don't punish people, but you don't apply the same punishment here. So what is the punishment? Whoever steals one time, the right hand is amputated, cut off. So if they steal a second time, their left leg will be cut off at the ankle. And if they steal a third time, what's going to happen then? So this is where scholars have differed. In the Hanafi school of thought, they said that you do not cut more than one leg or one hand. Because then what happens to the person's life? They just become a burden on society. They can't do anything. And it means they have a major problem or whatever. So you imprison them. So you don't cut more than twice. You imprison them until they're, going to get reformed, or they're going to, stop stealing, or they're going to, ask for forgiveness or whatever. Right hand, left leg. When you actually cut the part off, the bleeding should be stopped. It must be stopped through a cauterization process. So it means that the point is not for the person to just keep on suffering or let him bleed to death or something like that. If the thief has received the punishment and the stolen item is still available in his house or whatever, then the stolen item, is it returned back or not? So this is like a business economics question, right? So the person stole and they just got their hand cut off from stealing. That's a big punishment. Can they at least keep the laptop that they stole now? No, you can't, right? Because it still doesn't belong to you and you have to give it back. But now the question is, you stole the laptop and you broke it or you sold it. The punishment was applied to you already and you had the hand cut off. Are you responsible for compensating them back with the financial amount of money, for that item that was stolen? No, you're not, because the punishment was already sufficient for you, because it's not that item anymore. So there's no additional financial penalty on you. because you've already undergone the punishment. But if the item was available, then you have to give it back, because technically it never transferred. Right? We talked about valid sales, valid transactions. It was never a valid transaction, therefore the transaction is reversed. Last major thing is punishment for consuming intoxicants such as alcohol or drugs, even if it's a sip or even if it's a puff. That person will be whipped, but not with the whip. The person will be whipped with the cane or with the sandal 40 or 80 times. Right? Because the Prophet, peace be upon him, this was a discretionary punishment that he applied. So the Abu Bakr applied it with 40, Umar raised it to 80. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he implemented this punishment, but not specifically. So it didn't say specifically 40. People kind of counted approximately, it was like 40, 50, 60 times, something like that. So this is a lesser punishment actually. Whip it's not as bad. So this is up to the ruler to kind of put some kind of punishment for people who are undergoing or who are taking intoxicants, to prevent it from happening within society, right? To remove these ills from society. Now, does this apply to non-Muslims, by the way? No, it's not. It's not going to apply to non-Muslims, because for those people who are allowed to drink in their religion, it's not going to be applying to them. Lastly, it's another thing is called jinayat, retaliation for assault. Okay, retaliation for assault. Now I'm going to start this off with a quick question. Mahatma Gandhi, he said, a very famous quote of his, he said, "An eye for an eye will lead to a world of blind people." Who agrees with this statement? Who disagrees with this statement? Who has a criticism on this statement? The statement is nice in the sense that if you take it loosely, if you take it metaphorically, if we're going to be punishing people for every single crime that they're going to commit to us, and we're not going to learn to forgive people, then it's going to lead to a society where there's a lot of problems. From that perspective, it's a decent statement. If you take the statement literally, which many people kind of, unintentionally take it literally, what does it mean? An eye for an eye. If I poke your eye, and you're going to poke my eye back, right? Then I'm going to end up poking somebody else's eye, and that person's going to poke somebody else's eye, that person's going to poke somebody else's eye. So an eye for an eye is going to lead to a world of blind people, because it's going to keep on carrying this chain on. But as has been explained by the brother, it stops. This chain doesn't exist, because it only happens to the people who poked first. And then that's it. Right? So if you don't poke anyone's eye, your eye is not going to be poked out, because there's a sense of justice there. There's a concept of justice. So the idea of eye for an eye in Islam does exist, but there's restrictions to it, as we've been mentioning here. This is what's known as retaliation for assault. This is the last part. So if somebody intentionally assaults another person and destroys, and when I say destroy, I mean loosely, in the sense that the function is gone. If they destroy their eye, or their nose, or their ear, or their tooth, or something along those lines, then what's going to happen? You can, same like murder, you either retaliate back, or you forgive and you get blood money. Similar like murder, but the difference is you can't kill a person for taking your eye. So what happens is, that part is going to be retaliated against. So if somebody ruins your eye, you lose one of your eyes, the punishment, if you choose and you opt for retaliation, because you're still alive, so it's not your family anymore, right? That's going to choose. You get the decision, because you're alive. So you decide whether to accept compensation for it, blood money or not blood money, but like organ money, or whatever you want to call it, for it, or you want to retaliate and have the other person have the same punishment afflicted to them. This can apply to any limb or body part that is able to be properly retaliated against without exceeding the limit. So the thing is, there are certain parts. So if somebody were to mess up your eye, you can have their eye messed up, and you're not going to mess up their second eye, right? But if somebody has given you an internal injury, let's say they broke one of your bones, they snapped one of your muscles, sometimes there's some kind of internal thing that happened. They punched you really badly. They beat you up like 5 times. They punched you, and you have internal bleeding and internal injuries. how could you retaliate back against them in the same way? Say, well, they punched me 10 times, I'm going to punch them 10 times back in the same places. But what happens is, if you were going to do something like that, can you be sure that you're going to do the same amount of damage? No, you can't be sure, right? So it's very difficult to exact retribution for something like that. Therefore, it's not allowed. And you have to settle for compensation in an injury which cannot be properly retaliated against, because it may exceed the level in which you got in the first place. So internal injuries, broken bones, muscles, and all that, they have to accept compensation. So what happens basically? So if someone has taken your eye, or someone has taken your nose, or someone has taken whatever it is, if you opt for retaliation, that part is taken away and removed, but it's not removed in the same way that they removed it from you. It's just simply that organ is deemed, taken out in whatever form, whatever way it happens. So somebody, for example, rips off, and it's getting graphic, but this happens, right? Somebody goes and they ripped off 2 of your fingers, right? And they were torturing you, right? And they grabbed a hammer and they started pounding on your fingers, and they literally smashed them. They smashed your nails and you suffered, and it was a form of torture. Your 2 fingers now are not functioning at all. You only have 8 fingers left to work with. You can't eat, you can't pick up things, you can't, you lose your job because your fingers now are here. Are we going to say that monetary compensation, oh, well, let's just have the other guy? No. So this idea of, next time you're gonna beat someone up, or next time you're going to do something to someone, you better think what you're damaging on their body, because it's going to come right back to you. So retaliation has a lot of wisdom in it. So let's say you so somebody smashed 2 of their fingers intentionally. How do you go and get them back? It's not to inflict the same amount of pain that was inflicted upon you. So it's not about the pain, it's about the function. You've lost the function of 2 of your fingers now, and you cannot use them anymore. They don't do you any good. So that person's 2 fingers, same 2 fingers, are going to be taken away in terms of their function, in whatever manner it is. Whatever, you inject something so that they stop working, or you cut them off, or whatever it is, they're going to have the same thing done to them, so that they cannot use those 2 fingers as a punishment, as a retaliation for what they've done. Now, if you opt for compensation instead, and you give forgiveness and say, you know what, I'm not going to take somebody's fingers. I'm going to take compensation. What is the compensation? If you have an organ where you only have 1 of them, like a nose, you only have 1 nose, the compensation is 100% blood money, 100 camels. Because you only have 1 of them in your body, and that person has taken it from you. You cannot smell anymore. This part of your body is gone. So if they've destroyed your nose, they have to pay 100 camels, or equivalent, that amount. If you have organs in a pair, so they destroy 1 of your ears, or they destroy 1 of your eyes, you still have at least 1 eye or 1 ear left, then the compensation is half of the blood money, 50 camels. If they destroy something which you have 10 fingers, for example, they destroy 2 of your fingers, compensation is 1/10 for each finger, so it's 20% of the 100 camels, which is 20 camels. And likewise. And then the scholars have all the difference of opinions, say if somebody goes and rips off your beard, or does this to you, or messes up 1 of your feet or something like that, what is the compensation, all that. There's a lot of difference of opinion. Inshallah, it will never happen. And even if it does happen, it's not going to happen. There's no retaliation here in America. Remember, it has to be under legitimate authority. So if somebody does that to you, and you take him to court, and then you find them the other day, you find them on the street, you can't go and say, I'm going to take your 2 fingers now. It has to be under an authority. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Yeah, I mean, there is difference of opinion, but this is majority opinion, yes. Yeah, there is a difference of opinion on how you execute the person back. Yeah. So there is an opinion among some scholars that you're supposed to inflict punishment on the person exactly the way they did the crime. Right. So why does that apply to adultery? Because adultery is considered to be one of the things which ruins society in the worst of ways. That's why it's been given a specific thing, because not only did someone take somebody else's right, taking somebody else's property is one thing. taking somebody's honor is considered to be even higher than that. Than property. Right? Then murder. Oh, I see what you're saying. Then murder, huh? Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. Well, this is the way I was taught, but I'm sure there's a better explanation. It's considered to be a crime against society rather than a crime against the individual. No. Because what it does to the entire society, it's more against society than it is just against one. No, I mean fornication. Yeah, so adultery against the spouse, but as well as against society. Oh, you're talking about adultery straight up. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, I don't know. It's something that, to be honest, I didn't go and research this too much because we don't apply it, right? So there's a lot of like divorce cases to research and economics cases to research because it happens on a daily basis. This stuff I've not actually gone into so much depth. How applicable is it in the first place? Yeah, that probably could be. Yeah. Also, I heard also that because if you actually had 4 witnesses, you were doing like something in public. That's really disruption of society rather than something in private. Like if you're stealing, you're not stealing in public. Stealing is by definition in private. By the way, that's part of the definition as well. It has to be in a private area. So that could be it. I'm sure there are other explanations, but I didn't look at it in detail. But this would be a good research paper for somebody. Yeah. No, you can. You can't. You don't need to go and tell the other partner exactly. So you say, I did this, and you don't have to go and call the other person out. Because, you see, here's the thing. So if you confess and you say, I committed adultery with this person, right? You get the punishment on you, but for the other person, right? In case you were lying, let's say you're just a person who's ready to take 100 lashes. You don't have other witnesses to show that other person committed fornication. So one witness as you is not sufficient for the other person. If you want to punish both, yes, you would need 2 separate confessions. That's right, yeah. So if you admitted, then you get the punishment for adultery during the li'an, during the accusation of adultery with the spouse. So it's not the 80 lashes. Actually, the notes I think are mistaken there. The second time, if the person who's being accused of the adultery admits to the adultery, they don't get 80 lashes, they get the punishment for adultery. Yeah, maybe the other 2 were lying. Exactly. So you can't establish it based upon one person's testimony. Just even if the person is so adamant of punishing themselves to get you, still you can't establish that. Right? Because someone, I can imagine someone willing to take 100 lashes to get you, let's say to get you killed, for example. Right? Let's say I say, you know what, I committed adultery. I committed fornication with that woman who's married. So for me it's fornication, for her it's adultery. Right? So I'll take 100 lashes, but I hated that woman my whole life. I'd rather her die. Right? So my testimony, one person, even if I'm willing to take 100, cannot apply to her. Usually, yes. So for retaliation, qisas. Retaliation is qisas, by the way. So for retaliation, if 2 people both committed the murder of one person, both of them will be retaliated against. So it's qisas against both of them. Except there's always some room for certain circumstances. That the judge decrees that, one guy was, stepping on his leg and the other guy shot him, then there's a difference between that, right? Because he didn't know, for example, that he was going to shoot him in the head or something like that. So that's a good question. If there's a corrupt judge and you know that it happened for sure, the family wanted to go and kill the person to get real justice, are they allowed to do it? Okay. From the law perspective, Islamic law, they're not allowed to do that. Now, the question that you're asking in reality is, if they did it and they're very clear in what they did, will they be held accountable by Allah on Day of Judgment? I think that's what you're asking, right? The thing is, only Allah knows the answer to that question. Right? Allah knows there are some times where you go outside the law because you know what's right. You know it's right. And there are some times where you have to stay within the law as well. So it's very difficult to give an answer and say that yes, in this case it's going to be okay. There are always exceptions to the rule, but exceptions never make the rule. So you can't give a general statement and say yes, it would be allowed for them to do so. Or no, Allah will not forgive them for what they've done because even if the judge was corrupt. The reason is due to perception. You can never give a general ruling because the judge is corrupt in their perception. So if you tell them, yes, in that case it's okay, then what happens? They will decide, we know the judge is corrupt, so we're going to go ahead and do this thing. What if the case was not determined that way? What if they were corrupt and the judge was not corrupt? You just gave them an answer to go and justify killing somebody else. That's why the law is always based on general rules. And in the end, Allah will always hold you accountable for your intention that you had, the knowledge that you had, and how much in line it was with what you wanted to do. All right? So if you 100% are 100% clear what happened, you're 100% clear that the judge is corrupt, and 100% clear that this is the murder, and you went and did that, I would think that inshaAllah, Allah would not hold you accountable for the action. That's what I would think, but it's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The main question I think you have is, do Muslims have to abide by the law of the land because of a promise that they made? Right? This is a lot of modern day scholars, they make this argument that yes, you have to abide by the law of the land Islamically. So it's your Islamic duty to abide by the law of the land because you made a promise when you came here. Right? I find this argument to be very weak. The reason is, number one, I didn't come here. I was born here. I didn't promise anyone anything. Right? It's true, I didn't promise anyone anything. I didn't make any citizenship pledge. I'm a citizen by natural birth. Right? So the fact that I'm here, that's why, that's what I'm here. That is, I'm not saying I'm going to break the law. I'm saying that no one told me to make a promise. So there's a very interesting book. There's a PhD thesis written by a professor in Yale. I forgot what it's called now, but it's called something in citizenship, concept of citizenship in Islamic law or something like that. Very interesting, talking about the different ideas of what is citizenship and what does it constitute. Jewish scholar, Jewish man in Yale. Really great book. But the point is this, right? Here's my counter argument. To say that you're Islamically bound by every single law that's made in a country, and if you violate one of those rules because you made this kind of promise, let's say even if you took citizenship, then Allah is going to hold you accountable for that. I cannot buy this argument, because that would mean that, let's assume you were a Muslim during the American Revolution. You should not have participated in the American Revolution against the British, because the British put certain laws on you and you agreed to abide by their laws. And now it's time to revolt against this imperial power. You're going against the law. So we wouldn't even be Americans in the first place if we felt, let's assume that we were there during that war. Where do you have a revolution? How do you go against the law? There can be no such thing as an idea of revolution in the first place if you say we're going to abide by every single law. Revolution is to overturn and overthrow those laws and that ruler. Right? So Islamically, there's no way I feel that this argument can apply across the board. Now, in most cases, perhaps yes, right? But never a blanket statement. So that's why there's law, and then there's what's Islamically, morally right and wrong. Now, you should almost always be following the law. But there are some exceptions where what's morally, and this was his question, right? What's morally right supersedes and trumps whatever some unjust law that someone has passed. Like, who was the woman who did the sit-in on the bus? Rosa Parks. Right. So, was Rosa Parks a criminal or was she a hero? We look back at her now and we say she's a hero. But at that time, if we say, well, she agreed to abide by the law of the city and she sat in a bus where she wasn't supposed to be sitting, from an Islamic perspective, she's sinful. She should not have done that. She went against the law. I refuse to accept that argument. I cannot accept that reasoning. So I think we need to be very careful. There's a PR statement, right? We don't need to say that, well, we made a promise when we came to this country and everything. Muslims are generally law-abiding citizens. Unless you're going to do something so immoral where it's our obligation to go and stop you from doing something, and we have a very great moral system, generally, if that's going to happen, then it's better for you that we don't follow the law in that case and get rid of some racism or get rid of something by protesting or whatever. So I think that's a better way of framing it. They do it for PR reasons. No, I know it completely. I don't like PR fatwas. Don't make a PR statement, but don't make a fatwa in the name of Islam for the sake of PR. Like this whole, I'm just going to throw this out there because this gets to me. This whole idea, one guy wrote 2-volume fatwa on terrorism. One fiqh council issued a fatwa that Islam does not allow terrorism, and they had a whole ceremony with pictures and everything showing that terrorism is haram in Islam. That's just the most ridiculous thing to do. Now I understand for PR reasons, you make a statement, Muslims don't condone terrorism. But to make a fatwa means that we've analyzed all the sources of law and we've looked at everything and looked at the circumstance and everything and saying that, no, it is not allowed to commit terrorism. That's like having this super fatwa saying that, this huge research paper we've written and everything, saying that Muslims are not allowed to sniff cocaine. I mean, there's no need for that. It's so clear and common, right? There's no point in doing that. You only did it for PR reasons. So there's a difference between make PR statements, but not PR fatwas. Because fatwa means you've done some research and you've discussed it and you've debated it and you've come to the conclusion. It's not a conclusion, right? So anyways, alhamdulillah. No. Expiation is for unintentional and semi-intentional, not for intentional. Yeah, if you kill someone unintentionally, there's no sin. Yes, expiation is still there so that you are extra careful next time to make sure it's never going to happen again. Self-defense, it depends also. It depends on the circumstance. The judge will determine if it's real self-defense, stand your ground law or not stand your ground law. If the person is one color or another color, it depends. So the thing about stoning, there's no specified way of doing it. So this idea that you're saying that take one giant boulder and just crush the person, this is something that can be allowed as well. They're not going to be running after you if you're going to be caught by the police, right? So you're not going to be running anywhere. So the idea, again, keep in mind, we all have our own biases, right? About how it is and how it's taking place and the person running away or something like that. It doesn't happen that way generally. And just keep in mind, this happens when somebody admits and they confess. So let me tell you one more ruling here. The other ruling here is if the person confesses and then as soon as the stoning process starts, they change their mind and say, I retract my confession. I didn't do it. I was, whatever. I didn't really do it. I'm taking my confession back. You have to stop. For riba, yeah, there's no specific punishment for taking riba. Because riba transaction is not considered to be like valid transaction in the first place. There's a haram transaction that, actually it's valid, but it's haram transaction. No, there's no specific punishment for riba. But if riba, for example, so when we talk about discretionary punishment, let's say riba becomes so prevalent in society and the Muslim leader is trying to get rid of it, he could apply a discretionary punishment. Anyone who engages in riba transaction, 5 lashes, for example. So there's room for that if the leader decides to do that. So anyways, we had a debate in Irvine Masjid regarding this. They couldn't find anybody else, a Muslim scholar, to represent the side which says that we should keep the death penalty in place in California. And I was in my retreat, enjoying myself in Phoenix, sitting at Barnes & Noble, doing my research, writing my books and stuff like that. And I got a call from Irvine Masjid saying, there's no one else is willing to debate on this. Sheikh Jamal is on the side that death penalty should be abolished, and no other scholar is willing to come and discuss it. So they flew me in, even though it wasn't my stance, and said, can you just pretend for the duration of the thing that it is your stance? So I did that. So I pretended that I was in favor of keeping the death penalty in California, and we debated with the 2 lawyers on each side. We debated Sheikh Jamal Diwan, and at the end I said, actually my opinion was the other side. I was just debating it because we couldn't find anybody else. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because actually most Muslim scholars in the area that they contacted, no one was willing to debate Sheikh Jamal on the other side of it, because they were on his side as well. But let me explain to you. So I know there's a lot of Muslims who took the position. So why did they take it? Because most Muslims will associate this. They associate death penalty is in California and death penalty exists in Islam. California is becoming super liberal, and Western decadence society is just going down and down and down, and now they're trying to remove the death penalty. So their immediate association is they're just trying to get further and further away and do all these other things. We need to fight for an idea or a concept that Islam still has in their system. So from them, they're only looking at it from the perspective of there's death penalty, and they're trying to remove death penalty. And death penalty is a just punishment in and of itself. And they're trying to show that Islam is so cruel and brutal, there should never be a death penalty. So their framing of the issue was that they're trying to get rid of it because they feel the penalty of killing someone for a crime, any type of crime, for us it's murder, is unjustified. That's the way they viewed the issue. You viewed the issue and I viewed the issue completely different. Especially, I changed actually after I started researching it more when they asked me about the issue. We view it, you and I, for example, Sheikh Jamal, for example, we view it as there's too many people dying unjustly from the death penalty. There's a lot of race factors involved. More black people, more Latinos are being killed rather than white people. So the system itself is unjust. Therefore, in Islamic law, you have this thing, if you have a doubt, you're supposed to get rid of it, but California law doesn't have the same thing. Right? So there's a problem with that, and there's another problem with that, is murder is not the only penalty for the death penalty. Whereas in Islam it is. So most Muslims, they didn't make that association, or they didn't look at the issue from that perspective. That's why they rushed to defend the death penalty. So you ask me why. So that's the reason why. That's why I said that there's a level of propaganda, right? Anyone watch Aladdin? Okay. So remember the princess steals the apple? And what happens? The big Arab guy with a turban on, he takes out a sword, and he grabs her hand on the table, and he's about to chop off her hand. Now what's the problem with that? The problem with that, what we learned today is, number one, okay, he's not an authority. Number two, there was no court case and there was no judgment. Number three, there's a doubt and a shubha because she was giving it to a poor kid. So there's a doubt there. So you're allowed, if you steal that, your hand's not going to get cut off. Number four, the apple does not have a value that your hand is supposed to get cut off for. Right? So all of these things, but the idea is poor innocent princess goes to give an apple to a poor kid who has no food, and what does Islam do? Chops off her hand because of that. That's the image that sticks with you. That's the tool of propaganda. And we saw on Friday, for those of you who attended the event on Friday, we saw Michael Singh, not even a Muslim guy, right? Not even an Arab guy, explaining the similar concepts in Aladdin, showing how the song came out and all of that stuff. So we have to be very careful about this, propaganda idea. And the last thing I want to emphasize, this last point, is that we live in a society. You see, sometimes you have to go against what society feels. We're not conformist as Muslim. Whatever society feels like doing, we're going to go ahead with that. This society in which we live in today, it's a society which focuses on supporting the victim or anyone who's going to play the victim. And what ends up happening is we always tend to say, this punishment is too harsh. This punishment is too harsh. We need to go easy, because the background is punishments were way too harsh. The death penalty in England was for 85 different offenses, capital punishment. Right? So the thing is, we come from that background, we've gone to the opposite extreme. We need to go back and balance ourselves out and realize, look, you're telling me that the punishment for JP Morgan going and ripping off $15 billion from people is they go and settle out of court for $1 billion and they get away with it? And then they go and steal other people's money and they get away with it? And the bankers go and mess up the stock market and they get away with it? What kind of society is that? You're not going to have punishments? You shouldn't, people have to suffer for that, and the taxpayers go and bail everyone out. And the whole system is messed up. So we need to really think, when we just focus on the idea of what are punishments designed for, and does our society really implement good, just, proper punishments to rebalance society? I don't think so. But khair, inshallah. We're going to end here. Zuhr time, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.